Hello and welcome to session 2 or video 2 of the Studyology series. This video is for those of you who haven't been able to, say, attend one of the live Studyology sessions, or for those of you who maybe have attended a session but would like to do some revision or catch up or revisit some of the core concepts. So as we get started, it would be really useful for you to have this document nearby, which is the workbook that accompanies these videos. This is where we do all the reflection exercises. You'll also find in the workbook definitions of some terms, explanations of the homework exercises, and a few other bits and pieces that are sort of going to help you navigate your way through the program. So if you've got that nearby, that would be really useful. If you don't, you'll find a link to it in the information below this video, so you can access a copy if you don't have one already. So let's kick off. So before we do, just want to take a moment to get present, I guess. And in the last lecture, in the first video, we talked about this process of getting present as a kind of a key starting point for psychological flexibility, which we'll revise in just a second. But it's really just a simple act of focusing your attention into the moment and what it is that you need to do. So even as you sit down to watch this video, there's probably a whole bunch of other things that are competing for your attention. So you might have social media open, you might have your phone nearby, you might be in the library and you can see other people walking past. There might be people talking to you that you're interacting with at the moment. There's lots of things that are competing for your attention. And as we set off to cover the content for this session, it's worthwhile just taking a moment to kind of reorient ourselves to where we are and what we want to do. Now that could be as simple as just taking a couple of deep breaths and really noticing each of those breaths, where you feel them in the body, whether they're short, quick breaths or kind of long, slow breaths. And just also bringing us attention to the task that you have at hand, the thing that you want to do, the thing that you want to focus your attention on. So for now, we can simply say, I'm here, I'm watching this video, and I'm doing so to learn something about how to tackle procrastination and improve the relationship I have with my studies. And just take that moment to do that. Take the moment to, if you can, put aside all the other things and all the other distractions that will try and draw you away from this video, and kind of commit yourself and your attention for the next 30 or 40 minutes to this video and getting as much out of it as you can. So a quick recap where we went with the first lecture. So we kind of started with the antidote first, and the antidote to the problem that we're tackling here is psychological flexibility. And that's really being able to be present, to open up to whatever kind of thoughts and feelings and experiences and perceptions show up, and then orient our attention and our efforts towards the thing that we value most, towards the thing that we want to be doing, to do that thing that's consistent with our goals and consistent with our values. So in this context, psychological flexibility is being able to make decisions and choices and behave in a way that's consistent with our goals and values, even in the face of difficult thoughts, feelings, memories, and experiences. And that's contrasted, it's quite a conscious process, and it's contrasted to the rather unconscious process of just sort of being on autopilot, being impulsive, being reactive, just going with whatever happens at the time. And you can see how procrastination is kind of a failure of psychological flexibility. Procrastination is the being distracted from the thing that we want and need to do, and heading off elsewhere in a kind of reactive and autopilot and impulsive way. So what we're trying to develop is this psychological capacity that we call psychological flexibility. And so we started in these presentations sort of with the antidote first. And there's three components to psychological flexibility, all of which we'll cover over the course of the program. In the last session, session 1 or video 1, we talked about the art of being present. I gave you a couple of exercises to try in that context. So there was a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 exercise, and there was a noticing and naming. There's an audio file that you can use, but you can really use many different type of mindfulness-based techniques to practice this process of being present. It doesn't require necessarily long meditations or long techniques. It really is simply the act of getting present in the moment that we're in and orienting ourselves to the task or the situation that we need to orient ourselves to. And then there are 2 other components, open up and do what matters. We'll cover those in sessions 3 and 4, I believe. So yeah, quickly, I gave you a couple of techniques, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, noticing and naming, and I sent you away with to practice these techniques as a homework exercise. So if you remember, I suggested that you set aside some distinct study times, and that when you sit down to those study sessions, that you engage in some kind of mindfulness or be present activity, whether it's a breathing exercise, whether you listen to a meditation on an app or something like that, or whether you listen to the audio files that we provided as part of the program. Essentially, that you do something at the beginning of that study session to orient yourself in time and place to what it is that you need to be doing. And doing that as a kind of a way of tackling all the various other things that are going to be competing for your attention at that point in time. And I sent you a way to practice that, so you were practicing part of that psychological flexibility capacity. So if you've got the workbook nearby, I'd be interested in you taking a couple of moments to answer a couple of the questions that you'll find on page 7. So essentially, did you engage in the homework exercise? If yes, how did you find it? What did you experience? Did the act of being present at the beginning of a study session improve the quality of that study session? Did it not have any impact? Are you not sure? And then if you didn't actually engage in the exercise, so if you didn't actually do the homework exercise, then what got in the way? Is it maybe a symptom itself of the broader procrastination? Or was there something about the exercise that you didn't like or didn't resonate, or you weren't sure about, or wasn't well enough explained? And kind of capture those in those 2 boxes there. And then see what lessons you can take away from that, because we'll talk at the end of this session about the homework exercise for the next week or for the next few days, and see what sort of takeaways you might be able to take from this reflection process for that. And then if it's a comprehension kind of issue, whether like maybe I haven't explained the concept well enough, then maybe that'll be a trigger for you to make contact with me. Just send me an email and ask for clarification about the issue, or the clarification about what sort of tools you could use for being mindful and present and things like that. So if it's a comprehension issue, get in contact with me and I'll see if I can clear it up. If it's some other barrier getting in the way, might it be that in this next week you might be able to address that barrier in some way so that you are able to practice that exercise. So you can pause the video and fill those out, but let's kick on otherwise. So what I want to cover today is a concept called experiential avoidance. If psychological flexibility is the antidote, then experiential avoidance is kind of the poison, so to speak. And we're going to talk about what experiential avoidance is, and then we're going to talk about how it links to the dynamics and behaviors of procrastination. So how does experiential avoidance explain what is happening kind of when we're procrastinating? So most of us understand the concept of avoidance. It's the act of avoiding or withdrawing from something. It's a pretty effective strategy, particularly in the world of physical threats. So if there's something that's threatening your life or safety, then avoiding that thing, avoiding that situation, distancing yourself from it or withdrawing from it is a very effective strategy. And hence we have pretty well developed kind of behavioral avoidance circuits built into our brains that fire off under conditions of perceived threat. Now, whilst it's a pretty good strategy in the world of physical threats, it's not a great strategy in the context of what we might call psychological threats or experiential threats. Now, these are things like unpleasant sensations, internal body sensations, unpleasant thoughts, maybe difficult thoughts about ourselves or self-critical kind of thoughts. It might be difficult memories, so remembering stuff that's happened in the past that was unpleasant and attempting to avoid or withdraw from those. And unpleasant feelings as well, or emotions, if we want to use a similar kind of word. And then finally, it's kind of the avoidance of situations that evoke any of those, which are actually useful for our growth and development. And that's kind of a really key point here, is that it's okay to distance oneself or distract oneself from unpleasant internal events if doing so doesn't take us away from something that's valuable to us, that's meaningful to us, that's likely to make our lives better or make us better over time. But if in the process of kind of avoiding these negative internal states, we are then in turn avoiding the things that give our lives meaning, that give us opportunities for growth and development, then we're losing out, and we're losing out significantly. So in terms of a formal definition, experiential avoidance is attempts to avoid thoughts, feelings, memories, physical sensations, and other internal experiences, even when doing so creates harm in the long run. And it's the opposite of opening up and accepting our experience. And that opening up to and accepting of our experience is what we'll talk about and deal with in video 3 or session 3. Now, experiential avoidance can become a pattern, and two kind of broadly kind of patterns that you'll see is that we either start avoiding situations that we predict will elicit these unpleasant situations, or we try to control or suppress these experiences when they happen. So an example I give frequently in the context of my own life is social situations. So social situations, particularly like kind of large crowds or large groups, tend to elicit in me a number of uncomfortable kind of thoughts and feelings. And as a result, I tend to avoid those kinds of situations because I don't like the feelings that accompany with them. Now, the downside of this is that a lot of those social situations would be beneficial to me if I engaged with them. So it might be a networking event where I can meet like other clinicians or researchers or people from Flinders, or it might be a large social gathering where I've got opportunity to catch up with people that I haven't caught up with in a while who I did want to see. So in the service of kind of avoiding that uncomfortable internal experience, those uncomfortable thoughts, I end up missing out on something that could help me grow and help me get better as a person. Examples of experiential avoidance, like what it looks like at the kind of behavioural level. It's avoiding reminders. It's avoiding talking about or thinking about certain situations or topics. Avoiding social situations, the example I just gave. Avoiding situations that have been previously unpleasant. Distracting ourselves. Engaging in kind of personal rituals and safety behaviours that sort of disconnect us from the situation or disconnect us from the feelings we're having inside. Trying to suppress negative feelings inside through abuse of alcohol or drugs, and other kind of self-modification behaviours that are really an attempt to avoid having to confront or face up to other difficult thoughts and feelings. So it might look like restricted food intake or purging in kind of eating disordered behaviour or self-harm in the case of someone trying to avoid or distance themselves from other types of internal pain. Now, the reason it can become a problem is that it can get established quite quickly and become a kind of a pattern of avoidance. And the reason it can become a pattern is because in the short term it tends to work. All right. So if there's a situation that makes you upset and you can avoid that situation, well, you'll spend less time in the short term being upset. And so your brain quickly learns that whatever behavior you've engaged in has alleviated the sense of distress, and therefore it's going to increase the likelihood that it will recommend, so to speak, or drive you towards that behavior in the future. The problem is when we're avoiding situations that are related to our growth is that in the medium to long term we accrue we accrue problems as a result. All right, so one is that the intensity often and the frequency of those unpleasant situations actually increases over the long term. We lose those opportunities for growth and development. And sometimes we create new or more severe problems because of the avoidance. So you'll know with procrastination that as the more you procrastinate, the more assignments build up and tasks build up. And then that in itself becomes more distressing over time. And then we know also, for example, if you're using drugs or alcohol to sort of alleviate states of distress, those drugs and alcohol can then themselves start to elicit negative kind of side effects and symptoms and things that just end up adding overall to your stress load. So I've got a video that hopefully I can play and record in here that sort of helps explain this concept quite well. I'll play it now. Just notice your reactions to it. Take any notes while you're doing to see whether it sort of fits with your kind of experience, and then we'll come back in a tick. I'll see if I can get this to work properly.
From things we don't want and to move towards things we do. This is a story of human motivation. Humans are motivated equally in two directions: to move away from things we don't want and to move towards things we do want. And this is a jolly good idea. It's a particularly good idea for things happening in the external world. But then humans invented language, and we developed words for things, including things happening in our internal world, like thoughts and emotions. And then we applied the same rule. Being clever, we classified difficult feelings like anxiety, doubt and uncertainty as things to move away from, and emotions like happiness, excitement and relief as things to move towards. This makes intuitive sense. But applying the away and towards rule to our internal world leads to problems. Think about something you've done that you're really proud of, like running a marathon or passing an exam. And then think about the early days or moments when you were moving towards this achievement. What were your thoughts and emotions then? The short-term result of moving towards something we really value is usually negative thoughts and uncomfortable emotions. So our minds tell us to move away, just as if we saw a bear or a moving bus. Then, if we do move away, the first emotion that shows up is relief. So to summarise, language has encouraged us to try and move away from bad or difficult thoughts and emotions and to move towards good ones. But this is a trap, because it can mean we move away from what matters most to us in life. This is called experiential avoidance. Experiential avoidance can work in the short term, but the problem is it doesn't tend to work in the long term. If we make it a priority to avoid difficult emotions, we start to construct our lives around avoiding things we don't want rather than moving towards things we do want. So what do we do about this? In order to beat experiential avoidance, we firstly have to understand what our values really look like. What do we really want from life? Then we need to help people to build their willingness here, to experience these difficult thoughts and emotions, in order to keep moving towards here. We can't have love without fear of rejection. We can't achieve greatly without fear of failure. And we can't change our lives for the better without worrying that we will change for the worst. There is no way around this. It is the human condition. But we can cultivate the ability to experience difficult thoughts and emotions in the service of what matters most to us. This is called psychological flexibility. Psychological flexibility helps us build a life around towards moves rather than away moves. Whilst this can hurt, we get to do the things in life that matter most, and this makes a difference.
Alrighty, so hopefully you kind of see that the... Oops, I've left it playing in the background. So hopefully you'll see that this video kind of asserts a couple of those kind of key points. Right? It talks about the fact that under certain conditions our avoidance of unpleasant internal experiences takes us away from the things that are most important to us. And you're probably starting to see now and put together some of the links in relation to procrastination. So in procrastination, certain feelings and thoughts and difficult sensations are arising in the context of doing our work that takes us away from this thing that's important. So it helps explain why sometimes something can be really important to us, like a degree or going to university or getting our education, but then we find ourselves in this pattern of kind of continually avoiding or putting it off or putting it aside, and the confusion that can kind of, and shame that can kind of come along with that, where we don't really understand why it is that we're pulling away from the thing that's important to us at the time. So if you want, feel free to pause the video, take a little time to kind of think and react to the video. Particularly interested in, and in fact there's some room on the in the workbook to do this. I think so. Or maybe not. We'll actually cover it for the homework exercise. But I'm interested in you thinking about other situations that you know are probably beneficial to you in some way, but you maybe sometimes avoid because of unpleasant thoughts, feelings, or sensations, or memories. So places that you don't go, or people that you don't hang out with, or situations that you don't put yourself in, even though you know you would probably get a lot out of them. And you don't do that because of the experience that they elicit, and the strong desire or the unwillingness to have that experience. Alrighty, so let's spend a bit of time now trying to link and understand how experiential avoidance and procrastination are related. And the way we're going to do that initially in this first version is to look at the relationship between stress and performance. So on the vertical axis here, you've got performance. So that's ranging from your worst possible performance to your best possible performance. And then on the horizontal axis, we've got kind of, just broadly speaking, your stress levels or your kind of arousal levels, extent to which your kind of agitation might be another word. And that goes from zero agitation or stress whatsoever through to what we might consider kind of a panic or a really high or severe level of stress. So when we're talking about simple tasks, the relationship between stress and performance isn't particularly interesting. Like, very simple tasks can usually be performed under most levels of stress. So brushing your teeth might be an example here, that it doesn't really matter how stressed you are, you're capable of carrying out that behavior. It's very automatic, it's very simple, it's very well defined. It's not really linked in any way, shape or form to your stress level. If you're stressed, you might forget to engage in it, but you wouldn't actually have any problem in engaging in it. When it comes to more complex tasks, and we're thinking here about writing an assignment or reading a research paper and taking notes and summarizing it, or beginning to map out a PhD or a thesis, we're talking about complex tasks. And complex tasks do have a relationship. Performance does have a relationship with our stress level. That relationship is that as stress increases, our performance actually increases up to a point in the middle, which we'd probably call kind of the flow, or being in the zone. It's when we're at our optimal performance level. There's actually a relatively high amount of stress or arousal or sort of agitation at that stage. It's just that it's really well focused. And so this feeling of being in the zone or being in flow is where we're intensely focused and concentrated on the task at hand. Most of everything else disappears. We're not really thinking about the past. We're not thinking about the future. We're not distracted by other things that are going on. We're really just kind of 100% in on that task, and we're moving and navigating through it effectively. It might be hard and it might be difficult, but we are finding a way to move through. And so, not surprisingly, most of us want to achieve this flow or zone state as much as possible. But beyond the flow zone state, you've obviously got increasing levels of arousal or distress or agitation actually start to impact on performance. So you can see that as stress levels head towards panic, the quality of our performance decreases. And you kind of know this intuitively, that the more stressed you get, there's a point at which it becomes actually really hard to do any kind of complex task. You really just can't kind of organize your thoughts or organize your behaviors in a way to get the task done. So the challenge of getting into the flow state is that you've got this zone of increasing level of agitation, increasing level of distress, increasing level of, it could be other things like boredom is a particular one. It could be anxiety. It could be just a sense of struggle or a sense of heaviness, a sense of difficulty. But we have to kind of move through that emerging level of stress if we're going to get to that optimal performance zone. And this is the point where the experiential avoidance idea comes in, is because as these distressing or difficult feelings emerge, there's a tendency for us, because of experiential avoidance, to bail out of the task at that point in time, right? To comfort ourselves by distancing ourselves from the task we have at hand, maybe picking a simpler task or an easier task or a more enjoyable one. And it is an attempt to suppress or remove ourselves from that unpleasant experience. Now, sometimes that's not even necessarily a conscious process. Sometimes people, if they're asked at the time at which they sort of disengage from the main task, whether they're distressed, they'd probably say no. But if we tuned in a little further, we'd probably find some difficult thoughts, some worries about performance, some concerns about whether they've got the ability to carry it out. Maybe they're bored or disinterested with the task and that they don't really enjoy, or they can't really make their way through that boredom stage. So if we look closely, we'll typically find some kind of negative internal experience at that point at which the person's trying to ramp up their performance. Now, if that keeps happening, if you keep kind of bailing out of the task before you actually get a chance to experience what it's like to, relatively regularly work in a state of flow or in the zone, then study becomes less rewarding over time, because each time you sit down to study, there's this kind of unpleasant entry point, and then you bail out of the task. And then typically, obviously, things start to build up. Right, so now you've got more tasks to do. And in fact, sometimes what happens is, instead of this slow rise of distress or agitation, people shift straight over into a panic state, right? Because they realize they've got things due, they've got lots of things due, they're due right away. And then they have to do this work in a state of panic or high distress. And whilst many students can get that work done in that stage, it's typically not the best quality work, right? And it's not their best work. They tend to be less creative. They've got no contingency. They've got no space to handle any contingencies or setbacks. They can't put the same level of attention to detail into what it is they're developing. So it kind of lacks depth. So they can get the job done, but it's not done very well. And then that sort of contributes to an ongoing sense of, well, work is only ever stressful or panicked or done in a really high state of arousal. And so increasingly the student gets less and less experience of study being rewarding, of the reward of writing a good essay, the reward of learning something and applying it in some way, shape or form. And then they kind of cycle between the two. So they're either putting stuff off or they're having to do a bunch of things in a panic state, and they never get that experience of flow. Oops. Now, in terms of like what the procrastination looks like at the point at which they're bailing out of the tasks, there are many different ways. Humans are incredibly creative in the way that they avoid the things that we need to do. There's a few examples here. So immersive activities are where we distract ourselves with something that is very enjoyable but also immersive, really takes our mind off the fact of what we've got to do. Sometimes we'll pick other tasks that are kind of do have a high value to them, so that we might consider them to be kind of ethically or kind of morally good choices, but they're still things that are taking us away from the thing we actually have to do. Sometimes we might overscan or fuse with our emotional states, so we decide that we're too tired or stressed or unmotivated, and we use the presence of that unpleasant or difficult emotion as a sign that we should not engage in the activity. We can engage in fairy tale thinking. The most common is to assume that future you, tomorrow you, is going to be able to do the task better and more efficiently than current you. Or it might be this idea that you do your best work under pressure. And for some people that does apply, but for a lot of us, high pressure does not generally bring out our best work. Sometimes it can simply be a kind of almost a childlike I don't like it, a refusal to just engage in something that you don't like or don't enjoy. We can turn tendencies or preferences into rules. So you might have made the correct observation that you work a little better in the morning. You're more alert and more productive and more focused. But then you kind of use that as a rule, so that if it is the evening or it is the afternoon, you don't engage in study because you've got this rule that because you're a morning person, you should really only ever be doing your work in the morning. And yes, the work that you do in the evening might be of a lower quality, but it would still be far better to do some work in the evening or in the evenings leading up to a due date than it would be to just do it on the final evening or on the final day. One that I fall into the trap of regularly is saying yes to new projects. So the excitement of a new project it always tends to beat the hard work of an existing one. So when we confront a project that we've got to do, we've got the reality of actually having to make it happen. We look elsewhere for something that's more enjoyable, more creative, bring us a positive emotion into our life, and then focus in on that. And because often that other project does have some value, it's kind of a combination of saying yes to a new project and that substitute achievement idea. Perfectionism can interact here with procrastination. So sometimes people's standards about the work they expect from themselves can be an excuse not to do the work, so they know that they won't be able to do a project or an assignment at the best of their ability, so they kind of keep putting it off, so they never actually have to deal with or confront the fact that their standard is incorrect, or that the standard they've set for themselves is holding them back. And then just on a kind of basic everyday process, multitasking. So you might have your project open up on one window here, but then you've got social media open here, you've got your phone. You might be having a chat with someone. You might have some music playing or a video playing. So you kind of have the task open, so you give yourself the illusion that you're working on the task, but really your attention is divided across multiple sources. So over the course of an hour, you might only spend 5 minutes actually working on the thing that you need to, and the rest of the hour flitting your attention between these different things. So there's lots of different ways that we procrastinate. It might be worth taking a moment to kind of think about from that list, what are your most common strategies? Most people look at this list, and if they've struggled with procrastination for a while, they'll usually find that they've done most of them in some way, shape or form. But then there'll be certain ones that are kind of more their signature strategies. So for me, saying yes to projects, multitasking, and probably substitute achievement would be my signature ones, the ones that I would those traps that I would fall into most commonly, and then to a lesser extent some of the others. So a quick review. So this is another way of thinking about procrastination, I guess. So the first way that we looked at was this by looking at the interaction of performance and stress, or performance and stress. Another way to think of procrastination is as a cycle. So it's a cycle that you get kind of trapped in. So we would start here with forming an intention to do some work or to do a task. And then for whatever reason, the doing of that task elicits some difficult internal experiences, thoughts and feelings and memories. That activates this experiential avoidance kind of process. We detach from the task and we engage in our kind of most common procrastination strategies. The task gets delayed, it builds up, and it accrues more complexity, and usually we accrue more tasks over time. And then that often means that the work that we're doing is in a panic. Now, when we do work in a panic, it's typically of poorer quality, but we also experience it as more aversive. We start to develop an association between doing work and it being of a lower quality, and that can elicit a whole lot of maybe some beliefs about ourselves, about how good we are at the task or other kinds of things. We rarely get to experience that flow state. And then when the next job comes along and we sort of start thinking about doing that next job, not only do we have all those original kind of origin negative experiences that sort of started the procrastination process, we've got all of the other stuff from this curve now, right? Or from the other part of this cycle, sorry. We've got the shame in terms of the tasks we haven't done properly in the past. We've got this kind of ongoing association between work and feeling unmotivated or disconnected or stressed out. And so the load, the emotional load that shows up at that point in time is now increased. Okay, and so experiential avoidance is more likely to happen again, right? And then you can see how you could get caught in that cycle over time. And we can see students get caught in these kind of procrastination cycles. It might only take 1 or 2 or 3 weeks to actually start building this set of associations between work and the negative experience, and that cycle can kind of get out of hand fairly quickly. So there is the question of, so if you're doing this program, if you're watching this video or attending the sessions, then it's probably relatively fair to say that you at least perceive that you struggle more than other people. It might not be the case because procrastination is so common, and I think everyone in some way, shape or form tackles it at some point in time. It's possible that your perceptions of your procrastination are worse than your actual procrastination. But if you're doing the program, it's at least troubling enough to you that it's kind of getting in the way in some way, shape or form, and you'd like to address it. So then the question might be, why is it that you're struggling with this more than other people would? There's a few things that can drive this. Now, to be clear, these are things that can kind of get in the way of you tackling procrastination as opposed to things that are necessarily making your procrastination worse. So I would tend to argue that most of us experience it in some way, shape or form. Most of us would like to put certain tasks off that we don't really want to do in order to go and do something else that is more enjoyable or more engaging or more immersive or simpler or easier to do. And so the question isn't really whether you experience procrastination. The question is how good are your strategies for managing it, for keeping on top of it. So I would say it's kind of built into us to have this tendency, and what separates us is our ability to manage it. And so by doing this course, you're increasing your capacity to manage your procrastination tendencies. Now, what might be getting in the way of that? Well, there can be some personality factors. So things like conscientiousness, impulsiveness, anxiety. Our temperament can influence that. So if we're just generally more impulsive in life, that impulsivity can be kind of exciting and interesting in some contexts, but can be frustrating in the context of procrastination. You may be overloaded. So it may be the case that you are trying to live 25 hours a day in a day that only has 24, and that simply the load on you is too large, in which case the strategies from this program might work, but you might then also be wanting to look into just time management in general, your ability to prioritize and organize tasks, and also your tendency to take on too much, and why it is that you might take on too much and what's kind of driving that. Sometimes it's a bad habit thing, so we might develop work habits in high school, for example, that don't necessarily translate well into university life. We might have just developed, because we have actually quite a good ability, or we're quite smart or quite capable, you might have developed a habit of doing work at the last minute because you know you can. And in the past that's worked fine, but now you arrive at university and the level of work, the quality of work that's required is higher. And that kind of capacity to do things at the last minute is no longer really working. There might be some pressure on you from others, so you might be trying to live up to some expectations of family or friends, or maybe in that last point, living up to some expectations of your own that are maybe unreasonable or applying additional pressure. So in addition to kind of tackling your procrastination at your psychological level, there might be a component of talking to those from which you perceive that pressure, making sure that you actually understand that appropriately. And then maybe also looking at your own standards and your own expectations of yourself, and asking yourself whether you are being unkinder to yourself than you would be someone in a similar boat. Are you expecting more of yourself than you would expect of other people? And if that's the case, is that potentially contributing to the problem? Alrighty, so as with all of these sessions, what we cover in session is really only valuable if you can then kind of take those ideas and apply them in your everyday life. And that's why we recommend these homework exercises. People have an aversion sometimes to the word homework, but in essence, it's practice. It's the opportunity to actually get better at the skills that you need to get better at in order to do your work. So the exercise for this week is quite similar to last week. And it's just got an additional component to it. So each working day this week, or over the next couple of days, I just want you to schedule study times on each of the days that you would normally work at the earliest reasonable time for you. So you might say Monday to Wednesday I'm going to start studying at 9. Thursday and Friday I'll start studying at 12, depending on the nature of when your lectures and tutorials are and things like that. And at the point at which you're going to get started with your study, I want you to engage in some kind of present moment activity. So the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, the noticing and naming from session 1, or simply just your own kind of breathing technique, a mindfulness exercise from an app or something, or simply just the act of taking a couple of deep breaths and making a simple statement as, I'm here now to do this work for the purposes of whatever it is that you need to do. I'm here to do this assignment so I can get it in on time for this topic. So really just a kind of a statement that brings you into the moment, right into the moment, and orients you to the task and thing you need to do. Then I just want you to engage with that task. And that might be for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 2 hours, 10 hours. It doesn't really matter. At some point, it's likely that you'll want to try and divert away from the task. It might be very quickly and very early on, particularly if you've picked a hard task, or it might be later in the day that you notice yourself kind of deviating from the work that you've got to get done and heading off into one of those procrastination strategies. And I want you to try and get a record of them. Try and capture, what's actually happening. So I've got a table here on page 11 of the workbook. It's just a 7-day, really simple. I would suggest at the end of the day, just reflecting back over the day and noticing whether or not you engaged in any of these particular types of procrastination. So did I find myself, and you'll find the explanations of them here, right? So on page 10, and then you can just tick for day 1. Yes, I definitely overscanned with my emotional state. I definitely said yes to a couple of new projects. I was definitely multitasking. And just try over the course of the week, get a feel for what your patterns are. Now, it might confirm stuff you've already known. you might already have a pretty good read on what your main procrastination methods are, or it might turn out that there's some there that you didn't actually realize were kind of signature strategies, but it's not until you start recording them that it becomes obvious. And then there's a little kind of task 1B, I guess, 2B. If you can, and it won't necessarily be easy, but if you can, try to notice what it is that you're trying to avoid at the point at which you engage in whatever procrastination strategy it is. So is it anxiety or stress? Is it worry about your ability? Is it worry about time? Is it boredom? Is it like, what's the negative internal experience or combination of negative internal experiences that you think you're trying to distance yourself from, that you're trying to avoid, that you're trying to experientially avoid? See if you can start to hone in on what that is. Because then as we head into session 3, we'll be looking at how do you make room for those kinds of difficult thoughts and feelings. So it's good in this phase if you can start identifying what some of them are. And then, just repeat that each day, right? So each day set off with the same kind of goal. Scheduled to study time, got present, got on with the task, and then just noticed if I did, what kinds of procrastination strategies emerged, and keep a record of that in the workbook. So just additional stuff that we kind of covered in the first session, it's good to cover here. So the workbook, the slides, and additional materials can be found in that Dropbox folder, or you'll find them in Oasis Online if that's where you're accessing this. Have a good week, or if maybe it'll be less than a week before you tune into the next video, that's all cool. I'll see you back here next week or for the next video, and then if you've got questions or feedback or the concepts I haven't explained well enough, then really please feel free to send me an email to get that clarification, because I'd hate for there to be something that you're not able to act on because of a comprehension issue, like I haven't explained it well enough, and for that to be getting in the way as opposed to kind of something else. So thank you very much for joining me for this session. A quick good vibes shout out for those who haven't come across that kind of campaign before, but otherwise I will see you soon for video or lecture number 3. So take care.